this morning
Recording it.
1 Samuel chapter 3. I'm going to read from 1 through 20. This is a passage that we have heard before, I assume, but we will be journeying as we begin the series of the prophets. Now, the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. What's that? Yes. Okay. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his womb. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel, and he said, Here I am, and ran to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call. Lie down again. So he went and lay down. But the Lord called again, Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am. You called me. But he said, I did not call, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. It was then that Eli perceived that it was the Lord calling the boy. So Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering. Samuel laid there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell this vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. He said, Here I am. And Eli said, What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also if you hide anything from me of all that he has told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And Eli said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. So, as we turn our attentions to the prophets this summer, Samuel is not always one of the names that is lifted up, even though early on he is named as this prophet who is called when he is very young. And I thought he would be a good place to start because he begins to start this tradition of people who are called by the Lord and often have to help religious leaders and political leaders navigate the world that they're in, sometimes even delivering messages that are hard to hear, but nonetheless help the people grow and live in a way that God is asking them to live. In what is considered mainline church traditions like the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, a lot of us tend to be wary of the term prophet. We don't always like it. We pride ourselves on not being Pentecostals who talk often about prophets and prophetic traditions and prophecies. We often associate it with fortune telling, telling things in the future, overzealous evangelicals, or people who just existed in biblical times. We don't need those anymore. But the role of the prophet in the Bible is quite vast. While there are often individuals called to be prophets, like we'll see with Samuel, every believer is called to be prophetic in how they live their lives. And that's really what I want to get across throughout this summer. In the biblical tradition, prophets were not just people who predicted the future or brought doom and gloom onto the people. They were people uh, who were uniquely gifted to interpret the times. People whose job it was to look out into the world, look out into the church, look out into society, and rightfully interpret what God's assessment of it was. They were the people who advocated for people on behalf of God, and then in turn talked to God about the people. Like, God, don't be so angry with them. They're trying their best. They're trying to get it right. Please help these people. And then in turn, would tell the people, God doesn't want you to do it this way. Prophets were often people that were formed out of tumultuous times in history in order to strengthen things like moral clarity of nations and communities, inspire transformation, challenge injustice. They were often the people who confronted corrupt leadership, who advocated for better conditions. They were not loved often, but they were hated often. And yet, I don't know if we would be here today as the church without them. As Angela Davis once said, that radical simply means grasping things at the root. Prophets were the people who called people back to their roots, called people back to their core values. You've gone too far in the other direction. I'm calling you back to your past, to your covenant with God. Prophets were people who called people to recognize their potential in order to carve out a new future. In our story today, it is clear that such leadership was desperately needed in the community of God. During these days, there was a deep need for change. The leadership of Eli the priest had become marked by spiritual decay, compromised integrity. Even though he was a priest, he had allowed the world to get into his head. The text says that Eli's eyesight was failing, which is also a symbol of his gradual loss of spiritual discernment and moral clarity, not just about physical eyesight, but his moral insight was failing. That while God had been trying to work with him before, his influence was beginning to fade. Corruption was beginning to take hold. Eli didn't hold the same power, the same courage anymore. Over time, he had grown comfortable with wrongdoing. He refused to confront the actions around him. And Eli, like others in the community, had failed to address the plight of the marginalized, the pressing needs of the oppressed in the community. He was complicit in suffering, which had serious consequences for him and the people in his community. Though he was still a priest in name and in title and in function, though he was still doing his duties and going to the temple, though he was still going through the motions, God had stopped speaking through Eli. And thus, there was no one in this community to rightfully interpret the times, to look out into the religious and political scene and rightfully discern what God says about it. The days had become dark and grim. The future had become uncertain. And yet we know as the community of God that in such conditions, God still finds a way to break through the darkness, to break through the uncertainty, to break through the confusion. And it is this young Samuel who emerges as this new voice, chosen by God to bring about change in the community. A new leader who will lead the people with energy and passion, wisdom, and youth. I mean, we often forget how young some of these leaders were. A leader who will have courage to confront power structures and corruption. Someone who's young, who hasn't yet allowed cynicism to take hold. A leader who will learn over time how to rightfully interpret the times, refusing to call evil good and good evil. A leader who will help the people get back to their roots, return to their God, their first love, their first calling, their true desired end. So, this young, unassuming Samuel is the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's story. And at first, Samuel doesn't really understand what's going on. He doesn't recognize God's voice at all. He thinks it's Eli, not once, not twice, but three times. It takes him a few times to practice cultivating the gift, to practice understanding what God is saying, to practice understanding when something is God or not. He has to learn how to listen, how to hear, how to discern. He has to practice asking questions, developing intimacy, trying and failing. It is Eli, the one with failing moral clarity, who recognizes finally that it is God who is trying to speak to Samuel. Eli, who has lost his integrity. Eli, who once had all access to power but did not know how to wield it with wisdom. But in the end, the message is clear that when leaders fail, God will raise up an unexpected prophet. That when one chapter closes, another one is already on the way. When God desires freedom for entire communities, God will raise up prophetic voices. When God makes a promise, a covenant to Israel, God will bring it to completion. That is the message of Samuel. In the end, God uses a brave young Samuel to deliver this sobering, harsh message to Eli. And yet, it is not just for Eli, it is a warning to all leaders who risk losing their sensitivity, who risk moral decay. It is an indictment on all those who would ignore or make excuses for mistreatment, for discrimination, for religious violence, to all who have become comfortable and quiet. It is a reminder to stay awake and not give in to the powerful or the popular. To all of those who are capable of shifting opinion and law and culture and religion, it is a challenge for them to prioritize mercy and justice. And the message is a reminder for all within the community to not lose their spiritual sensitivities, their moral center, their humanness, to prioritize integrity, accountability, and the pursuit of justice inside worship and in society. Samuel goes on to become this pivotal figure in Israel's history, signaling a new era of leadership. And if I might, paving the way for all of the prophets that we will explore together. He was able to lead the people into a new chapter, not because of his training, this young boy, but because of his sensitivity, his willingness to listen, his willingness to say to the Lord, speak, because of his courage, because of his willingness to say what needed to be said, even if it went against the patterns of the day. And so, as we will explore, one of the things that the prophets teach us is the importance of listening to God's voice, A lot of us understand that voice in different ways. For some of us, it's church. For some of us, it's music. For some of us, it's journaling. For some of us, it's nature. But God is always speaking. It is our awareness which needs to be tuned. Prophets throughout the Bible exemplify the necessity of tuning in whatever ways that we can, whatever ways that we are called to divine guidance, especially in times of moral and spiritual crisis, which I don't know about you, but I think we're in. Samuel's story is an example of how God calls us to listen and respond, to have a posture of humility and attentiveness. We see a young boy who hears a voice that he didn't initially recognize, but it was his willingness to be disturbed and shaken out of his sleep to listen, his openness to understanding, his readiness to respond that made him a more suitable vessel for God's message. This teaches us that we too must be open and willing to hear God's call, whether it comes to us from diverse voices or different spiritual paths, whether it comes to us through the nightly news or whether it comes to us through a museum or through history or through art. We must be willing to hear God's voice, even when it comes at inconvenient times or in unexpected ways. You know just as well as I do that the world today is just so fast paced. You have the whole world on this tiny thing. And it's so challenging these days to quiet our minds, our hearts. We're bombarded with noise and the pressures of daily life. Yet the story of Samuel reminds us that it is in the night time, in the stillness and the quiet moments of reflection that we might hear God's voice through spiritual and social crisis. And so, in what ways might we cultivate spaces where we can listen? Listening to God's voice involves discerning the truth amidst the clamor of many voices. There is so much misinformation, so many different interpretations. Listening to God is about being able to differentiate between the voices of Eli and the voices of God. The voice of God among the myriad of influences in our lives, all of the things pressing for our attention. So, how do we develop spiritual sensitivity? It's connecting with scripture, it's studying with friends, it's being in community that allows you to explore doubt and questions, it's surrounding ourselves with wise counsel. And lastly, listening to God's voice often calls for action. When Samuel finally understood that it was God who was speaking, he said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." This response wasn't just about the fact that he heard, but it was about readiness to act upon what he heard. As you'll see throughout the summer, prophets teach us that sometimes listening to God's voice involves receiving challenging or harsh truths, things that make us uncomfortable, things that make our community uncomfortable, but are necessary for growth, for wholeness. Samuel's first prophetic task was to deliver a difficult message to Eli, his mentor, his guardian. And so God's messages for us, the people of God, are not always easy to hear or deliver or implement. But sometimes it is those very things that lead us to transformation. And so we are called to be courageous, even when it's dangerous or uncomfortable. We are called to stand up for those who are being harmed, to speak truth to power. God's voice often calls us to challenge the patterns of the day, to confront corruption, to work towards equity. And as followers of Christ, we are also called to do that. Whether or not we have the title of prophet, we are each called to be living prophetically. an integral part of our spiritual heritage. So, as we leave this space today, as we look for opportunities to listen to God's call, to heighten our spiritual sensitivities, let us be inspired first by Samuel and then by all of these different prophets that span a great deal of history. Let us strive first, not just to see the miracles and to see the big kind of sexy things that we think of when we think of prophets, but recognizing that it starts first with listening, being ready to hear and ready to respond. Let us carry with us the challenge to be prophetic voices today, advocating for the marginalized and tirelessly pursuing truth. For when God desires freedom for the people, God provides a prophetic voice. May we be those voices as well, ushering in new forms of community and the pursuit of God's world. Amen. And now is your opportunity to respond in ways that you might be moved, things that might be bubbling up inside you.
I think first the responsive reading that we had to begin with, how we would respond to God. My first instinct is not that. It was climb in bed, pull up the covers over my head and hide.
Yes.
and but I know that that doesn't work with God. That he does keep calling and he does keep pestering and he does keep after you when you know that you need to respond in some fashion. I have hope because I listened to what you said about the prophets having concern about the people, because I'm one of the peoples.
Yes.
And I'd like to know that somebody has mercy on us
Yes.
when we're not doing everything that we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So, and I loved your terminology of um, what was Jesus? Can't think of the word now. Well, I'll think about it. It will come to me. But the terminology where it came from our roots, the grassroots.
Yeah.
What was the word I'm trying to think of? That Jesus was known as a radical.
Radical. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
That explanation about being a radical
Yeah.
hit me. I thought, well, that's true, because when we get back to our roots and think about how we've grown and what we've learned, this is where our passion comes from.
Yeah.
And so we may become radical when we react to something that we see as being wrong. So thank you. It's very interesting today.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I resonate with a lot of what you were saying. And yeah, that connection to the people, I think, is important for us to remember as we're journeying through the prophets. They go through a lot. In studying mental health, I worry about them a lot if they were okay, because they do. They care a lot about people. They want people to be well. Uh, they want God to be merciful, always reminding God that you are merciful, do that. And they grieve for what the people are experiencing and how they mess up. And so remembering that so much of their heart comes through in a lot of their words. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to be reminded, as you pointed out to us, that Samuel wasn't, even though it was all in one night, Samuel wasn't ready at first. And even though Eli was off the track a little bit, the person off the track guided Samuel to God, which we also have to remember that could happen.
Yeah.
The off the track person could bring those people back to God. My question is, Eli sounded like once he got the information, he's like, okay, I guess that's what's going to happen. Again,
Yes.
he didn't like say, okay, I'm going to go out and try to fix it, or he didn't even tell Samuel to go out and fix it. It was just kind of one of those, he's going to do what he's going to do.
Right, right.
Which goes kind of back to I really don't have the power anymore.
Yeah.
Right. He's like, I'm not going to be able to change these people. I'm not even going to try. I might be part of it, but I'm just going to accept that God knows best.
Mhm.
Sometimes we have to remember that God knows better than we do.
Mhm. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting response. I mean, yeah, it just like, okay, I guess that's what's gonna happen. In all of the ways that he could have responded, and I wonder if, in recognizing what was beginning to happen with Samuel, like something is shifting and changing, and I'm not the person anymore. Um, I wonder if he just came to a place of acceptance. But it is quite interesting. It's a quick transformation. um, but yeah, that defeatist kind of, yeah.
Yes. Well, that's a Samuel was a priest, and the function of a priest is to do the things that are needed in the temple.
Mhm.
Uh, I'm sorry, Eli. It's
Eli. Mhm.
Eli was the. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. And Eli was carrying on the functions of the temple,
Right.
but he was open to uh, God. And that's why he was able to say to Samuel to listen to the voice of God. But the point is, what's the criterion
Mm.
for the message that's going to come from God? Because there were false prophets
Mhm.
who also said that they had, heard from God,
Mhm.
and but they had heard falsely. And how do you differentiate between the false prophets and the
Mm.
true prophets?
Well, that's
And,
another sermon, I guess.
and it seems to me that the center of the whole thing
Mhm.
has to do with the covenant that God made with the people in the beginning.
Mhm.
The covenant that God made with Moses and the
Mhm.
people whom God had delivered from slavery. And so the message then must always be a message of deliverance,
Mhm.
because that will point to God. And the question is whether what you are doing is serving the mission
Mhm.
of deliverance
Yeah.
and freedom.
Mhm.
And that's where I think Eli was going astray, because he was attending so much to the functions of the temple
Right.
that he was losing sight of the what was not being uh, freeing the people, liberating the people,
Yeah.
delivering the people from bondage. And that's what we'll find out more as we go through the prophets,
Yeah.
as to what the message is of what's hindering the liberating experience.
Mhm.
Uh, and that hindrance is what God is bent on overcoming.
Mhm.
So, you see, but I think you both it up very nicely.
That's really, yeah.
I think beginning with Samuel
Yeah.
is and Eli is the right place to begin.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful, a lot of beautiful things that you said. You know, starting with the covenant and the message always being about deliverance and liberation. And there are some harsh things that are said and done, to those who sort of thwart that mission, but recognizing that the overall arc, God is always trying to bring the people back to what the goal was: loving God, loving one another. Um, and in all of these different imperfect people and the different ways that they communicate, um, are really saying the same thing in different times in history and different communication styles and different kinds of different kinds of enemies that they're up against. But the goal is always, this was the goal all along, was deliverance. Um, in what ways are we ready to go there or not? Mhm. Any other thoughts or things coming up? All right. Well, I am excited about this. I think uh, the story of Samuel is one that is important for us always to come back to and hopefully sets us up well for what each of our prophets might have to teach us from their particular point of view and time. So let us cultivate the spaces in our lives to hear from God and especially to put that into action.